Life for slaves has always been indescribably harsh. There is no doubt that being enslaved is, and has always been, one of the cruellest things that we as humans have ever dreamed up. But what would it have been like to be a slave on a pirate ship, and what sort of things would slaves be forced to do? According to some sources, about 30% of pirates were black during the Golden Age of Piracy. As slavery was beginning to increase, what did that mean for these men? Were they members of the crew, or were they slaves? Or were they somewhere in between, not entirely enslaved, but forced to do all of the menial jobs on board the ship? Although pirate ships were generally more egalitarian than the rest of society, this doesn't mean that they were forward-thinking paradises. Welcome to Walk the Plank. Going up in the world. The first challenge that slaves would face was the ship itself. Pirates didn't often choose to keep or transport slaves from port to port, meaning that most slaves ended up on a pirate ship after their original ship was captured. Some captains weren't interested in slaves and would let them go after looting the slave ship, but others actively preyed on the slave trade, or were slavers themselves. We've covered what the conditions would have been like on a pirate ship in our other videos, but suffice to say that the pirate ships were grim places full of disease, damp, and terrible hygiene. And yet this would have been a step up from a slave ship. Slave ships in the Golden Age of Piracy were designed to have as much room for transporting hundreds of people across the Atlantic. One slave ship, the Henrietta Marie, carried around 200 slaves, who were confined to the cargo hold and chained down to plank beds. Because they weren't allowed to move, the cargo hold stank, and people often died from their injuries. From slave to pirate. Many runaway slaves ended up trading a life of hardship for another, still challenging life. Although if they were able to join up and become a part of the pirate crew, they could escape their bondage and live a freer life. While it was still possible that they'd end up back in bondage if they were caught, at least they'd have the chance to experience freedom out on the open seas. Pirates were creatures of opportunity and often attacked slave ships to get the valuables on board, but also to get the ship itself. Slave ships were usually undermanned and slow because of their large storage capacity, making them easy targets. But the effort of re-enslaving the people on board was often more effort than it was worth to keep the slaves, find a port and a buyer, and then get the profit. Instead, pirate captains took advantage of bolstering their numbers and offered the newly freed men a chance to join their crew. Not only the slaves, but also the crew on a slave ship were looking to escape and often leaped at the chance to join the pirate ship. The death toll was so high for slavers on these vessels that British abolitionists who wanted to get rid of slavery actually used the high mortality rate in their case against slavery. A floating prison. Pirate ships were challenging places to exist, even for the people who chose to make their living aboard a pirate ship. As we've said before in other videos, pirate ships were dirty, damp, and crawling with vermin and disease. Crew members often didn't have their own bunks and had to sleep on the floor or in hammocks, so where would that have left slaves? For the majority of the journey, the ship was the only solid land around. Slaves were caught between their lives on the ship or hundreds of miles of hostile ocean before the nearest port. Once the ship had set sail, the slaves were as constrained as if they were in one of the floating prisons that punctuated the age of piracy. Pirates treated slaves as disposable commodities, frequently not wanting to be responsible for feeding additional people on board the ship, especially as the pirates would already have found it difficult to provide enough food for their own crew. Corsair Galleys. During the Golden Age of Piracy, the Barbary Corsairs were some of the most prolific and brutal slave owners. The Barbary pirates from North Africa were given the authority to attack Christian ships and put everyone in irons, enslaving them and selling them on to make a profit. Admiralty records show that the British ships were easy targets, with 466 ships being captured between 1609 and 1616, and countless sailors being captured. The fate that awaited these enslaved sailors was horrific, and one which made death seem like a release. The men were chained to benches in the galley and forced to power the ship towards loot and other prisoners, rowing the Corsairs wherever they wanted to go. The oars were massive, measuring 12 meters in length and weighing around 130 kilograms. They needed between 3 to 5 men to propel each oar, with some extra large galleys needing 7 men per oar. Each man who was sentenced to slavery on board the ship was branded with the letters GAL, meaning that if he survived his 10-year sentence, he'd still be known to all his peers as a criminal and a slave. Once chained to the bench in the galley, the slaves couldn't leave their seat for any reason. They ate, slept, defecated, and urinated all in that one spot. They were caned if they didn't row fast enough or if they mistimed their oar stroke. One slave we know who escaped death in the galley was a man named Marot, who was sold for 400 reals since he was useless. He was kept barefoot and his head was shaved to stop him getting and spreading lice and other pests. Each day Marot and the other slaves were given a single meal of stale bread, bean stew, and a small cup of water. If the ship was attacked and sank, the galley slaves went down with the ship. The technique required to row the ship meant the rowers needed to stand up and haul back on the oars with their full strength, leading many men to die of exhaustion as they could no longer withstand the strain of rowing. When one of the men collapsed, they were finally released from their shackles, but only to be thrown overboard after having their throats cut. If they didn't die from the intense physical demands, the galley slaves would go mad from their captivity. Living on the ship. Galley slaves weren't only used to propel the ships. When they weren't rowing, they were kept chained to the bench, but were given other work to do like mending sails or unpicking rope. The Barbary Corsairs didn't only confine men to the galleys, they also treated them appallingly in other aspects of life. At night, slaves were held in places called bagnios that were hot, crowded, and horrifyingly unsanitary. During the day, they were forced to do back-breaking labor in intense conditions, constructing buildings and bridges. Some slaves were kept on board ships. Famously, Blackbeard kept a certain number of them on his ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. Mostly slaves on a pirate ship would be used to do the hardest and most menial of tasks, like working the pumps to keep the seawater out of the bilges, washing and cleaning, as well as running errands and securing food and water when the pirates landed in a port. Pirates could be incredibly cruel when it came to discipline on board the ship, often inflicting hard physical punishment for even minor misdemeanors. Slaves were treated with even less care than the crew members, and were often subject to physical abuse like whipping, beating, or worse. They were often kept in inhumane conditions, cramped into close quarters with other slaves, and called on day and night to tend to the whims of the captain and the other officers on the ship. Samuel Pepys once described a chance meeting that he'd had with two slaves who'd been taken by the Barbary Corsairs from the shores of the UK. The men recounted how they'd been given little to eat but bread and water, and were beaten frequently on the soles of their feet and their stomachs. Famous pirate slave owners. Black Bart Roberts, or as he was known to his mother, John Roberts of Pembrokeshire, Wales, was a notoriously cruel captain, and even worse to his slaves. As a young man, Roberts went to sea aboard a slave ship that made the run between West Africa and London before joining up as a pirate in 1720. He made a name for himself as one of the cruelest men sailing the seas, cementing his reputation when he captured a slave ship and demanded ransom from the captain. When the captain refused to pay up, Roberts set the ship alight without releasing the slaves, who were faced with the choice of burning alive or jumping to their deaths in the sea. Another pirate captain who had close dealings with slavery was Blackbeard. Initially a privateer, Blackbeard turned to a life of crime and piracy and began targeting slave ships. According to one source, Blackbeard's biggest payday was reportedly when he captured the French slave ship La Concorde, which had multiple slaves on board. Blackbeard kept 60 slaves on his ship and marooned the rest. Gaming the system. Why was it that pirates seemed to build these egalitarian societies on their ships? One author describes what he called the invisible hook, where most of the crew were just interested in making money and didn't want the hassle of keeping slaves. Pirates got paid on the principle of no prey, no pay, meaning that they needed to capture enough ships with enough treasure on board to make sure they could afford to keep going, and slaves made this system a whole lot more complicated as they generally weren't treated as people, instead just being seen as cargo. That meant that splitting the value of a slave between the crew was difficult, and so it made more sense to free them and have willing crew members. Keeping slaves on the ship would also take extra effort, as the crew would have had to be alert to stop them from deserting or bailing out in the middle of a battle. One pirate captain discovered this when he found out the consequences of having over half his crew being forced labor. 70 of the crew on the ship were forced to be there, so when the captain saw several men of war and wanted to chase them down and loot the ships, he soon found he couldn't when the crew refused to follow and fight the other ships. The reason they gave? There's 70 forced men on board, and so the captain had to find more appealing targets. Outro. Slaves were never going to be treated well, and it's a romantic ideal to think that pirate ships were a utopia where they were respected and given the chance to rise through the ranks. Most slaves were treated like disposable commodities, given barely any food, forced to do dangerous and backbreaking tasks, and then killed as soon as they couldn't work anymore. On the other hand, some slaves rose through the ranks and gained some measure of freedom and respect. So it just goes to show the rules change from one ship to another. The daily life of a slave on a pirate ship could be dirty and dangerous, but it could also be the start of a new story. Thank you for watching this episode of Walk the Plank. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Have a great week. Cheers.